Focus of the week, and as we prepare to mark Press Freedom Day on Saturday, we cross to Brazil. And you may be surprised to hear that the country of football and salsa has become a danger zone for journalists. With 5 reporters killed in 2013, Reporters Without Borders says Brazil is South America's most deadly workplace. None of those crimes have been solved, and the situation is only getting worse. 4 more journalists have been murdered in just the last 3 months, one in an execution-style hit in front of his home. All killed for speaking out about corruption. And with police brutality another major concern, it's no wonder that Brazilian but also foreign journalists are struggling to keep digging away at the truth. This report by our Brazil correspondent, voiced by Phoebe Lanza-Wood.
A small cross and a number, 543, marks the final resting place of Pedro Palma. The former boss of local newspaper Panorama is one of the latest Brazilian journalists to be murdered. He lived here in Miguel Pereira, a small town 2 hours from Rio de Janeiro. He had become the thorn in the side of the municipal government. It's something that few people here are willing to discuss, so we've had to film using a hidden camera.
He was talking about the mayor's wife and her expenses, financial irregularities. All that appeared in the paper. Nobody said anything about his death since it happened. It's certainly connected to the accusations he was making. Today, without Panorama, there's nothing. It's over.
It was on February the 13th that Pedro Palma returned from work for the last time. As he was getting out of his car, 2 men pulled up on a motorbike and shot him 3 times at point-blank range, an apparent contract killing. The price depends on the target and can be as little as €300. We met Palmer's wife Patricia on the street where he was murdered. 2 months after the killing, she says the impact is still keenly felt.
Nobody complains anymore. Nobody talks. The town is dead. It's as if by tearing away the voice of the town, by killing the person who spoke out, everybody has been silenced.
In Brazil, many of these killings have happened in isolated regions far from the major cities. Last year alone, 5 journalists were murdered. Since the start of this year, another 4 have lost their lives. That's made Brazil the deadliest country for journalists in Latin America. Sao Paulo is home to the country's Association of Investigative Reporters. For spokesman Guilherme Alpendre, it's a profession fraught with danger. In a country rife with corruption, major scandals are constantly uncovered, and with politicians and local police often involved, violence against journalists often goes unpunished.
It's true that the culture of impunity is what drives criminal acts and also crimes against journalists. Anyone in Brazil who wants to get rid of a journalist reporting any wrongdoing knows it's viable because of that impunity.
Police violence against journalists reached new heights after last year's mass protests. Abregi documented 176 attacks on reporters. No police officers were held to account. Criticising the police can be risky, as cartoonist Carlos Latouf knows only too well.
Police violence is a taboo subject. I've already been arrested and hauled in 3 times to the station for making cartoons about it. Here the police force is a sacrosanct entity. They can't be questioned.
André Caramante has also received death threats. He reported on many cases of police violence for one of the country's leading papers, the Folha de São Paulo. The journalist received threats after denouncing a former military police chief for inciting crime on social networks. He fled to New York with his family, where he took refuge for 3 months.
Many military police still think that whoever doesn't support them is an enemy. The policing system here is inefficient and encourages that way of thinking. Instead of protecting the people, citizens are seen as the enemy because they're not part of the military. And that's a logic that comes from Brazil's military dictatorship.
Caramante no longer works for the São Paulo Daily and plans to launch an online paper. But he continues to condemn police abuse. all the time reflecting on the worrying fact that more journalists have been murdered in the last 20 years of democracy than in 20 years of dictatorship.
Well, for more on this, we're joined now by our guest, Camille Soulier, who heads the Americas desk for Reporters Without Borders. Hello, thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Does Brazil have any independent media?
Brazil has many journalists who work as independent journalists. Media is usually under tight control of businessmen or political families who control the various states of Brazil.
So who are these journalists who seek the truth independently?
Most of these journalists are actually bloggers who've created their own independent platform, usually online. It used to be that radio journalists were the ones to turn to when you wanted independent and true information about corruption cases or organized crimes. Nowadays, this has largely been taken over by independent bloggers. For example, Décio Sá, who was assassinated because of his investigation on criminal organizations in 2012, used to be a reporter but became a journalist so that he could have this independence.
So does this mean that the internet is a free space?
The internet is a free space until local officials will drive you to justice because you've so-called reported defamatory stories about them. That's the case for blogger Lucio Flavio Pinto, who's one of the 100 heroes of the information heroes that Reporters Without Borders has published for the World Press Freedom Day, which is tomorrow. He has about 30 trials going on right now for defamation because he tried to expose corrupt local officials.
So does this mean that there's the violence, but there's also the legal system that's being used to muzzle journalists?
Exactly, because corruption is present at all levels. So it's very common that a high-ranking personality will try to control the judiciary and in their own interest.
And you mentioned radio. There were also grassroots radios.
Yeah, there are grassroots radios. Usually, they're more present in the provinces rather than in the main cities. The problem in the provinces is that these journalists are much more exposed to violence. They're much more vulnerable because they don't have the kind of visibility and support that their colleagues in the major cities do.
So does that mean they're safe in the major cities?
No, they're safer in major cities.
Relative safety.
Yeah, it's relative. I mean, Pedro Palma was assassinated in the Rio area, so.
Now, you mentioned corruption as one of the red button issues for journalists. There are others, aren't there?
Yes, especially drug trafficking. Décio Sá, whom I've just spoken about, was assassinated because he was investigating on drug trafficking in the south of the country.
And why are these violent attacks never punished?
Well, corruption makes it very difficult to actually condemn the people who are behind these assassinations because they have so much protection, because they're the ones who almost control the judiciary. And the impunity that results from this makes it seem like there will be no retribution for the criminals who assassinate journalists.
And is there a political will to see a change on this?
The authorities very often announce that they're going to implement security measures for journalists. However, the reality is quite far from the rhetoric. And, in last March, journalist Santiago Andrade was killed during protests in Rio while he was covering the protests. And this sparked the debate about the necessity of security measures for journalists, and so the authorities decided to organize a working group to discuss what kind of measures could be put into place. Unfortunately, Reporters Without Borders sent a letter to the authorities at that moment with our recommendations and asking that these measures be put into place for journalists who cover protests, but also all the journalists who are in danger. And we've never received an answer to that letter, and we've never seen any concrete action put into place. And once again, it seems that all efforts have dwindled.
Okay, so is there a popular support for journalists? Are Brazilians even aware that their country is the 5th most dangerous in the world for journalists?
The journalists are can be considered as human rights defenders in Brazil because they try to expose the corruption that ruins most Brazilian everyday lives. However, when they're confronted with the police in times of protest, for example, then unfortunately their importance isn't considered.
So how are they fighting back?
The Brazilian journalists are extremely committed to their work. They'll continue to report abuses, and they'll continue to fight for the right to inform. There are certain things that journalists can do when they're reporting on any type of difficult situation. For example, it's very important not to ignore any type of threat, to report it to your superiors, to contact organizations like Reporters Without Borders or local unions for support and for help. During protests, wearing a helmet can always help, distinctive signs of belonging to the press. Unfortunately, journalists also have to consider that their own life is at stake.
Now, next month, Brazil will be welcoming thousands of journalists, international journalists, to cover the World Cup. Will they be incited to keep their eyes on the game, do you think?
I think so. I think Brazil is very self-conscious about its image abroad, and so covering social issues will probably be slightly more difficult for foreign journalists. When it comes to their safety, though, because of this self-consciousness about their image, it might be some sort of protection for foreign journalists, but as long as authorities don't actually implement concrete security measures, then nothing is guaranteed.
So will you be trying to stage events to raise awareness about this?
We're definitely going to be taking advantage of the fact that all eyes are going to be on Brazil to expose the fact that it's one of the most dangerous countries in the world for journalists, yes.
And just looking a little bit further on the continent, what is the situation in South America?
The issue of impunity is present in almost all Latin American countries. In Mexico, in particular, it's a very big problem, as well as Colombia, Venezuela. Social protests have been very hard on journalists in Brazil, like in Venezuela. Unfortunately, Mexico and Brazil remain two of the most dangerous countries to work as a journalist.
Camille Soulier, thank you very much for having talked to us on behalf of Reporters Without Borders. Thank you. And with that, we wrap up this hour live from Paris. But stay tuned for a full news update at the top of the hour.